the cover piece this week, Cindy Yu looks at how the Chinese Communist Party spotted a business opportunity in the green industry long ago. China now covers more than 3/4 of the world's solar panels, while a third of electric vehicles sold in Britain are made in China. Is this the start of China's green era? Cindy Yu joins me now to discuss, along with Tony Danker, former head of the CBI. Cindy, you write in this week's magazine about China's green plans and how it ties in with their economic ambitions. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, so China has basically spotted an economic opportunity here in the global drive for renewables. The developed world has been getting more and more climate guilt over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And China, it is the world's largest polluter, but it's also the factory of the world as well. So what happened was as early as 2005, really, China's been looking into renewables as an export opportunity. It's really wanting to move on from the three things that underpinned its economy before, which is clothing, home electronics and furniture, and going into much more high-tech, green tech stuff. And this is great. This is a great business opportunity because the world is only demanding more of these things, not less. And what's amazing is, as ever is the case with China, when they set their mind to doing something, the industry just moves so incredibly fast that we're now looking at basically real domination of various renewables industries, from EVs to lithium batteries to solar power to wind power, all of these things. At the same time, the West is not supporting its own businesses in competing with China on these as much as the Chinese government is. So we see this kind of imbalance going on.
Tony, has the West been left behind on this? And specifically, how is Britain faring at a time when, for instance, the American government to have the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance? Is there a danger that Britain is particularly left behind in the race for renewables?
Yes, absolutely. And Cindy described it absolutely correctly. By my numbers, I think Chinese green stimulus is double the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, is 4 times the EU stimulus. And I know that in British politics, we're criticising the Labour Party for wanting to spend £28 billion on green stimulus. That would be a 40th of China. So we are left as a country really once quite ahead on a lot of areas of green technology, of green industry, suddenly finding ourselves completely outgunned by the rest of the world.
And do you think that perhaps there's a chance then that the net zero agenda can become an issue of national security in all this, and actually that we've seen some powers in terms of the National Security Act and the Industry Act? Do you think that should be extended in terms of these spheres, and government should play much more of a role in order to try and catch up with what the Chinese are ahead of us on?
Oh, I worry about that. I want to go straight to the wedge issue for Spectator audience, right? Which is a skepticism, a hawkishness towards China. But at the end of the day, this is about markets, right? And in a way, EVs are just the latest of yet another manufactured good at which China can dominate the world for all kinds of reasons. And as you say, the argument against the Chinese sort of dominating the EV market is either one of, well, their subsidies are too high. But to be honest, this is a sector that everybody's subsidizing. Even us in the UK are subsidizing this market. Or we're going to claim it's a national security issue. And I think we just need to be careful about that one, right? You will know much more than me about the China issue and how the UK needs to confront China in the new world. I think it's a stretch to say that them owning our EVs is a big national security threat. There are clearly some strategic industries we need to be careful about. I just don't think the cars on our street are one of them.
Cindy, Tony there talks about markets, and I wondered how much is this about kind of Beijing top-down order, state control since 2005, or has this just been something that's organic and responding to kind of changes in the West rather than any kind of central diktat?
You know what it was? It was China, in a way that it does, throwing a lot of money at things and just seeing what sticks, right? So in 2015, it has this industrial policy called Made in China 2025, which is basically giving itself a 10-year window in which to really excel at the high-tech industries of the future: semiconductors, robotics, aerospace, renewables as well. And it's just chucked lots of money at all of these sectors. And renewables has been the biggest success story from this. Not so much semiconductors and not so much robotics, all of these other things. And so we're looking back now and thinking, oh my God, how do they do that? But actually they bet on a lot of horses. And when it comes to, the net zero agenda, I think there will be an interpretation of this story, which is that, oh, China's been egging us on to go to net zero just so that we would buy their goods. It's not so much that. It's that it's been clear for quite a long time that this is where the world needed to go in tackling climate change. It's been clear. It's been clear to the West as well. I mean, we've been driving this kind of climate targets What we haven't been doing is driving the industry that would be providing these goods. So the UK is this world's second largest installer of offshore wind, but we don't have a wind manufacturing industry in this country to speak of. So why don't we? So it's that kind of incongruity that China doesn't really have, because it's just, thinking about all of these things as business opportunities very strategically. And then to Tony's point about the security concerns, I think let's see how much just in 10, 15 years they really dominate the EV market, right? It is technically possible for an electric vehicle to be switched off by a manufacturer remotely, right? So let's say 2/3 of British cars on EVs on the roads are Chinese in 20 years. If they all en masse shut down, clearly that's a security risk. But there are so many other ifs involved in that. Could a Chinese company, will it really do that, considering that would be pretty much suicide for that company to be kind of killing its customers? Will the Chinese Communist Party really demand that of a company? All of these different things, I think there are a lot of ifs here. But when we talk about national security in this kind of fevered era that we're in at the moment, a lot of it is about what is the potential for something to go wrong? What is the potential for something to happen? And it's technically possible, but will it really happen? And that's the analysis that policymakers have to make.
Tony.
Well, look, I think what this whole thing poses a real question about is, can the UK compete in a green industrial revolution that is mostly made affordable by big countries in the world through subsidy? And we have a government right now that doesn't want to participate in subsidy. Although, by the way, we'll throw in a little bit for Nissan the other week and a little bit for, BMW and Mini a few months ago. So I think the government's a little bit confused about what their stance really is. But this is a government that doesn't want to compete with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US or with the Chinese or the European stimulus. And I understand why. I understand the principles behind why. But let's be clear, it means you lose, right? And then we have a Labour Party who want to invest at, what we regard as a pretty big amount. But even that isn't going to be sufficient. And so I think Britain needs a more thoughtful and a smarter net zero strategy than we've had so far. We've gone from Boris Johnson's 10-point plan, which I kind of loved. Actually, Boris doesn't get enough credit for being an absolute green believer, but it was an unprioritized strategy. We're going to have more of everything, every form of, low carbon energy. We're going to have all these kind of product markets like EV, to a Rishi Sunak strategy, which seems to be retreat. And of course, the truth has to be somewhere in between. Britain is going to have to work out, what are our bets in the green economy? We don't have a lot of stimulus, right? We don't have a lot of, we do actually have quite a few advantages in things, as you said, like wind, and we do have some in EVs. So let's have a strategy that places some bets rather than being subscale in everything in a world where scale matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And for my piece, I spoke to Adam Berman, who is at Energy UK, one of the industry groups involved in talking to these energy companies in the UK. And his idea was basically talking about these nascent industries like hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, with stuff that China hasn't really, and nobody in the world has really kind of cracked, because the technology hasn't really existed just yet. So why don't we use the British R&D specialities here? That would be a cheaper and more focused way of doing these things, rather than the American or the Chinese way, which has a lot of wastage involved when it comes to the money involved. So I think we could still wrest back the lead. It's just that Rishi Sunak's not talking about it. All he's talking about is watering down the net zero target or pushing back the petrol car ban, without really talking about what he can be doing for the EV companies in this country. So there is still inconsistency from the British approach, but maybe Keir Starmer will change that shortly.
Well, I think whoever's in power, right, we are subscale in what is a continental-sized economics, right? That's what green markets have become, continental-sized. So I think on all of these choices, which forms of energy, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, hydrogen, which colour hydrogen, I think Britain needs to take a very simple choice. Are we going to be distinctive in this? Are we going to genuinely lead the world? Are we going to be competitive in this? In other words, we need to kind of keep up, but we're not going to kid ourselves we'll be world-beating. Or do you know what? Is it okay to buy them in? Is it okay to import them? Is it okay that China makes our electric vehicles? Is it okay that China makes the blades in our wind turbines? Maybe the answer is yes. I don't know what the right answer is, But no government's going to have enough money in the UK to make all these bets. We're going to have to choose.
I mean, what have been the things stopping us from making those choices? I mean, obviously the question of money, and obviously money's tight right now. It's the refrain I hear most in Westminster and Whitehall is, there is no money left. So, okay, it's not just about resources. I don't particularly think it's going to be a sort of an election issue in terms of the kind of, green issues about investment, etc. What is it in terms of policy issues that have been stopping us from coming down on the side, whether it be right or wrong, etc., or coming down on one side for total? What are the kind of things that you've seen in terms of policy inhibitions in the last few years and a decade or so?
Look, I think it's just an inability to choose.
Right.
And maybe, I'm sorry to get a bit existential here, maybe that's about us coming to terms with the size that we are and our ability to compete in a world that's increasingly continental, right? Maybe we'll look back at this and saying it's a natural choice that a country like us needs to make post-Brexit, right? We're not in a big scale market that therefore has probably got the scale to play at everything. We're going to have to choose our bets. We're going to have to be pluckier, bolder, braver. And I think when you look at the UK, I mean, there are some areas where we have natural advantage. You've spoken about some of them, right? Wind is the obvious one, right? Poor Boris used to get mocked for saying we should be the Saudi Arabia of wind. But of course he was right? Wind is an obvious area where the UK should dominate. There are definitely parts of the EV value chain where we can dominate and lead the world, particularly in R&D. The idea that we're going to compete on assembly, cheap assembly of electric vehicle cars, right, is a hard one, but we probably do have to be competitive in it. We do have to have some kind of presence. And in the end, like every market, right, something being cheap is one reason to buy it, but something being better quality, better brand, better design, better style, I mean, that's the way the car market's always worked.
James, so one of the companies that I looked at that has failed in recent months is British Volt, a British startup which looked at battery making. And it was going to be one of the 2 gigafactories of making batteries in the UK. They went bust in January, and the former CEO has since then come out and blamed, to your question, blamed government instability. During the time over the last year when they were struggling financially, they had 3 different prime ministers. They have numerous different secretaries of state dealing with them in different ways. He directly pointed the finger of blame at the Treasury as well for not releasing funding because of the political instability. So I think part of it is just that we've had so many leaders, talk about Boris Johnson's 10-point plan. That was only 2 years ago, right? And now we've got a leader who's totally watering down net zero. So I think that is also a part of it. And maybe after the next election, things will stabilise a bit more. But the British political turmoil can't be ruled out, I think.
We've focused mostly in this discussion on Britain, Cindy, but how's it all gone down in China? And recently you wrote in the piece about President Xi visiting America and trying to signal to the West that China's still open for business. One element of this is the economics, but there's also the domestic politics to consider and a more prosperous middle class wanting to ensure you have higher environmental standards. Just talk us through that.
Yeah, exactly. So we often obviously see stories through a British lens, understandably, but actually for China, this kind of export opportunity is also about making sure that the country becomes cleaner domestically as well. And this might sound crazy to people watching at home because Beijing is so polluted. We know all about the country's opening of new coal plants. All of these things are happening, and it's true. But actually, because of the growing middle classes in China, they're demanding not necessarily political rights so far, but the right for their children to breathe safe air, to drink safe water. And the government in the last 9 years have said that they've announced a war on pollution, basically. And the figures show that. International observers have shown that Beijing air pollution is being halved in the last 10 years, that there are hundreds of millions more people with access to safe drinking water because the rivers have been cleaned up. So what we've seen in China is a huge industrial revolution, a huge scale of industrial revolution and really fast pace over the reform era. But now as people get richer and as the economy slows down, they're demanding more things like just environmental conservation, just being able to have access to safe air and water. And the government is trying to give that to them because otherwise it becomes a legitimacy problem for the CCP as well. Air pollution was one of the most controversial issues for a lot of Chinese middle class people, not so much voting rights, but that. So for the Chinese Communist Party, they had to do something about it. And that's why we see their domestic market for renewables is also huge. Chinese people are buying EVs en masse as well. So I think that's fascinating to think about this kind of coal guzzling country also becoming the engine of the green revolution globally.
A lot of people will say, this is hypocrisy on the part of the Chinese to be sort of pushing EVs our way and dominating markets while simultaneously investing in coal. I mean, I think Every economy in the world is guilty of such hypocrisy right now, right? And it's not really hypocrisy, it's trying to manage this transition. One of the interesting UK political points that hits this discussion is Rishi Sunak choosing to push back the ban on traditional cars and sort of postpone that idea of everybody switching to EVs. That was done for electoral purposes. But it has had a knock-on consequence on the economic viability of the EV market, right? The truth was, Britain was a highly competitive destination for electric vehicle manufacturing, assembly, R&D, battery production, because we had basically said by 2030, this market is go. And once you put that back for political reasons, and if we have an election where actually we're going to have parties trying to use green deadlines, green targets as a political football because they think the voters like it, that will have an economic consequence, right? Pushing back by 5 years, right, the deadline for everybody switching to EVs pushes back the development of the market, makes Britain a little less competitive. So there is a risk in an election year. If we want to try and row back, if the Conservatives want to row back from green pledges in order to win votes, there is an economic knock-on effect in a market where we're already struggling to compete. So that's my little pitch for keeping up green targets. Not because I'm trying to be some green campaigner, but because that's the way, one of the ways in which we can compete economically with people who are much bigger than us.